I was building for myself because I come back into the hobby and I spent a ton of money like we all do, and, buying is the easy part, right? You're just buying all these things. I was in breaks. I was, just looking at eBay. I was on the auction houses trying to pay attention to what was happening there. And I had just acquired a lot of stuff. And then I came to the point where I'm like, okay, got to start trying to move some of this. And I was trying to figure out, where do I grade it? You figure out pretty quickly when you get back in that grading is such a huge component of the hobby today that wasn't in existence in the, the 90s when I was a big collector. And so, you figure out where you want to grade things, if you want to grade them. And it was really hard. I got tired of basically copying pop report data into Excel or Google Sheets. And that was sort of the starting point. I just wanted to figure out how can I basically get the best return on my time? That leverage is really return on your effort in my mind. And so it was just really hard to make use of the data, especially when I wanted to understand the different pop reports to compare and contrast things. And so that was really the jumping off point. I was just like, okay, this is really, really amazing data that the companies make publicly available. How can I just streamline this and sort of answer my own questions? And so at that point, I just started to figure out how can I actually collect this at scale and build a product on top of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you said answer some of your questions. What were the questions that were kind of burning most frequently in your head? What were you trying to answer?
Yeah, I mean, like one of the most basic things was just how many cards exist at the different grading companies, right? So one of the biggest mistakes people make when they get back in is you sort of look at the world through the lens of how it exists today. So if you're entering the hobby today, you know that PSA is the behemoth. But that was not the case if you were collecting basketball or baseball or especially high-end cards in the mid 2010s there. Beckett was really the place where a lot of people were going with higher end collectibles at that stage. And so if you're getting back in, and I'm a Cleveland Guardians fan. I was a big Lindor collector, and I was, trying to understand the Lindor landscape. And a lot of his stuff was in BGS slabs. The PSA pop report was not super relevant. And so for a lot of his bigger stuff. And so I needed to figure out, just how much of what was his supply of cards, how much of it had been graded, what sort of had not been brought to the grading companies at that stage. So that's a big part of it. And then another quick thing you learn is not all grading companies grade the same way. Certain companies have certain tendencies, right? Like you send your thick cards to certain grading companies. You send your cards where its surface is less likely to be dinged to another grading company. You send vintage to certain companies. You send ultra modern. You send, TCG goes to different companies. So anyways, you just figure out it's not all equal. And so that was sort of the two questions, is just how many cards exist and have been graded. And is there an opportunity to sort of know what I know about looking and evaluating the cards to send them to the right company based off of how they grade, and then what the expected return is based off of what their, the market value is, the secondary market value after they've been graded.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you were thinking not 2 or 3 layers deep on this. I mean, so when you jumped into this early on, like put me back in that, I guess that moment where you go, okay, I'm going to start digging into this. I figured out I could do this at scale. Were the grading companies willing to work with you back then to make this work, or were you able to kind of skirt around the system and extract data manually?
Yeah, it's always a great question. They were sort of not caught off guard, but just sort of skeptical of like what my reason for being was, right? Like you just don't know. There's a lot of bad actors in this hobby. And so I would say when I started publishing data, it was just sort of like, okay, I think people were, intrigued by what I was doing, but not really sure what my agenda was. And so, I was very cautious and thoughtful about what we presented, and very limited in what we presented as well. We were collecting a lot of information, but I wanted to keep it super high level and very sort of, stick to certain themes. And so anyways, for PSA, for example, was the first one that we started talking a lot about. And, we definitely caught their attention. They reached out. We had good conversations with them, and it was very productive. And I sort of just explained to them what my mission was and sort of reason for being was. And I think they were receptive to it. And over the years, I have had a really good relationship with them. That said, I don't get any data really directly from PSA at this stage. I still at this, because of how they operate and what they're focused on and sort of what the APIs service, they just don't do what I do or sort of require to sort of, I basically want to take what the public sees. I don't want any special access necessarily, and I want to bring that to market. And so the pop reports are the best way to do that. So anyways, there's always been a little bit of friction at first, but usually we've been able to sort of get past that pretty quickly by just helping people understand, like, again, we're trying to be a rising tide lifts all boat, company in the hobby. And I think we've done that to a certain degree, at a small scale, but that's sort of like, again, what we stand for. And so I think that's really well received. But, when you're doing well, it's easier. When sort of you come up, if you're one of the grading companies and you're not thriving, you don't love us quite as much, And so I think you have to sort of, it just is what it is. And so, hopefully people give us the benefit of the doubt, though, that we're providing a good service. And ultimately, a lot of the grading companies at this stage work with us pretty closely.